There are places in the Midwest where history simply remains. Never goes away. It lingers. Sometimes it's found in abandoned farmhouses or ghost towns. Sometimes it's like a whisper in a forgotten cemetery, where names have weathered away over time on the headstones. And sometimes history walks beside you. Tonight's story comes from southwestern Wisconsin, where one of America's oldest ghost legends has survived for nearly 2 centuries. Witnesses claim to see a figure walking lonely roads. Others described a headless horseman. Some reported a woman dressed in white, while others swore it was nothing more than a black dog, or a sheep, or a floating light. Every witness described something different, and yet everyone agreed on one thing. Whatever it wasn't supposed to be there. This is the story of the Ridgeway Ghost. Hello and welcome to Midwest Shadow Files. I'm Dan, your host and Midwest Shadow Files storyteller. Tonight we get into the legend of the Ridgeway Ghost, probably one of Wisconsin's oldest ghost hauntings and legends. However, before we talk about ghosts, we have to talk about lead. And this little piece of mining history is important for the story. Today, the village of Ridgeway is quiet, a community of just a few hundred people nestled along the hills of Iowa County. But during the 1830s and 1840s, this is one of the busiest places in the American frontier. Long before Wisconsin became a state in 1848, thousands of miners poured into the region after rich deposits of lead ore were discovered beneath the hills. The area became known simply as the Lead Region. Mining camps appeared almost overnight. It reminds me of other places like Galena, Illinois, Dubuque, Iowa, where the mining of lead was huge. And as these mining camps started to spring up, so did taverns, boarding houses, trading posts, gambling halls. Wherever miners gathered, violence often followed. Think further west, stories like Deadwood and others. Many of these settlements were rough places. Arguments were settled with fists, knives, or pistols. One of the most important routes through the area became the military road, authorized by Congress in the 1830s. It connected frontier forts across Wisconsin territory. Stagecoaches traveled it, freight wagons rolled along it, families heading west followed it, and after dark, many refused to travel it at all. Not because of bandits or wild animals, but because of something they claimed was waiting in the darkness. Now, I will say this. The earliest versions of the Ridgeway Ghost don't even agree on what the ghost was. Instead, they describe encounters. One traveler claims something climbed into his wagon. Another said a strange animal appeared beside his horse, only to vanish into thin air. And another insisted he had spoken with a traveler, who simply disappeared before reaching the next bend in the road. And the haunting thing about all these reports, these were real people during the time with credited and respected backgrounds. By the late 19th century, newspapers across Wisconsin were discussing the Ridgeway Ghost like it was just another everyday common occurrence in the area. One of the most influential collectors of these stories would later be in Wisconsin folklorist Charles E. Brown. Brown spent decades gathering oral traditions from across the state. Rather than dismissing the stories outright, he documented who reported them, and his research revealed something fascinating. No two witnesses described exactly the same ghost. Fascinating. So what we have going on here in this story is actually a group of hauntings. Unlike most hauntings where one spirit repeatedly appears in one form, the Ridgeway Ghost seems almost like a group of ghosts. One witness saw an old man, another described a young woman, another encountered what looked like a calf standing in the road, others insisted it was a giant black dog with glowing eyes, and of course others reported an orb of pale light floating silently ahead of their wagon. Whatever people encountered, each incident seemed to change. Which raises an unusual question. If dozens of people experienced something, why couldn't they agree on what it looked like? The answer depends on what you believe. Was it a ghost or folklore shaped by fear? We'll explore that after the break. Hi there, Dan here, and welcome to Midwest Shadow Files. If you've been here for a while, I just want to thank you for following along. We always appreciate our listeners, and for some of you who might be checking us out or listening for the first time, welcome. We started out as Iowa Shadow Files, and so on some of our older episodes, you might see that title, but after about a year break, we expanded the podcast to include all of the Midwest, including some places further out that we might include at some point. No matter what, we'll research and bring you the stories. And if you have a story that you'd like to hear or share, we'd love to hear from you. The best way, of course, to reach us is through email, and you can always reach us at midwestshadowfiles@gmail.com. That's midwestshadowfiles@gmail.com. More stories to come, new episodes dropping on Mondays and Wednesdays. But for now, let's get back to the rest of the story. Before the break, we explored how one lonely stretch of Wisconsin's military road became home to one of the state's oldest ghost legends. But now comes the question every historian eventually asks: where did the story begin? How did we get here? Like so many legends pass from one generation to the next, the answer isn't simple. There isn't one origin story, there are several. And each one tells us something a little different, not necessarily about ghosts, but about the people who lived here. Let's start here. This is the murder legend. The oldest and perhaps most dramatic explanation claims that the haunting began with murder. According to local tradition, sometime during the early lead mining boom of the 1840s, two brothers became involved in a violent altercation at a tavern along the military road. The details vary, but in some versions the brothers were attacked after a gambling dispute. And in another, they became caught in a drunken fight that spilled into the road. Both died. Their bodies were buried nearby, and almost immediately, travelers along the road claimed something strange began appearing after sunset. Sometimes the ghost stood silently beside the road. Sometimes it walked behind wagons. Sometimes it chased horses until both animals and drivers were nearly frantic. The story spread quickly among miners and stagecoach drivers, and soon it became common local advice. Don't travel that stretch after dark. What's fascinating is that historians have never found definitive evidence confirming the murders happened exactly as the legend describes. That doesn't necessarily mean that the story is false. It just means that frontier communities often kept incomplete records. Many deaths went unreported beyond local newspapers, or, you know what, they weren't even reported at all. Whether the brothers existed exactly as described remains uncertain, but the legend certainly did. By the late 19th century, another explanation emerged. Instead of murder, perhaps the Ridgeway Ghost had been invented. Wisconsin folklorist Charles E. Brown recorded stories from longtime residents who believed local pranksters were responsible. Now, let's just picture this for a moment. A miner is heading home after working a 12-hour underground shift. It's nearly midnight. His lantern barely illuminates the road, and there's a sound through the trees that spooks his horse, and suddenly, someone dressed in a white sheet steps from behind a tree, or hangs a lantern from a pole, or releases a black dog on the roadway. It wouldn't take much. And once enough people believe that the road is haunted, they no longer need pranksters. Their minds fill the gaps. Fear has a remarkable way of doing that. One reason the Ridgeway Ghost survived, while so many frontier ghost stories disappeared, is because of the newspapers. By the late 1800s, editors weren't simply reporting local news. They also collected unusual folklore, strange happenings, and of course regional curiosities. Readers loved ghost stories, especially when those stories had supposedly been witnessed by respectable citizens. And let's face it, good stories sell papers. In 1902, the New York Times published a feature discussing the famous Wisconsin ghost legends, and among them the Ridgeway Ghost. The article described decades of sightings and noted that nearly everyone in the area knew someone who claimed to have seen the phantom. Interestingly, the newspaper never presented the ghost as proven fact. Instead, it treated the legend as something woven into the identity of southwestern Wisconsin. Whether readers believed the ghost was real almost didn't matter. The story itself had become history. And then we have Dr. Cutler's encounter. Perhaps the most famous eyewitness account involves a physician identified as Dr. Cutler. One evening, he was returning home by wagon. The road was quiet. But that didn't really cause alarm. His horse had traveled this route many times. Nothing seemed unusual. Then, without warning, the horse stopped. The animal refused every command. Dr. Cutler later claimed he looked upward and saw a figure sitting calmly at the front of his wagon, just watching him. He reported that it didn't say a word. It just sat there motionless. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. The horse immediately continued down the road as though nothing had happened. Whether Dr. Cutler truly experienced something paranormal or whether exhaustion, darkness, and imagination combined to create a terrifying illusion, we'll never know. But his account became one of the cornerstone stories of the Ridgeway legend. And it's important to note this because this wasn't just any witness. Now we have a story from a professional, a doctor, very respected in the area. And then we have the story of John Lewis. Lewis was reportedly traveling the military road after dark when he became convinced something was following him. And it wasn't just lazily following along or keeping its distance, it was closing in. Every time he looked over his shoulder, the figure seemed closer. His horse became increasingly agitated. Lewis urged the animal faster. The faster he rode, the faster this mystery follower seemed to pursue. The story varies, but in one telling, the figure ends up blocking his path. Lewis grabs his knife and attacks, but when he lunges with the knife, the blade passes right through the figure and ends up with Lewis being thrown to the ground. He is later found injured, and when he arrives to safety, he never recovers and dies. Maybe from the injuries, but maybe from fright. But there is no reliable coroner report linking his death to shock. Like many oral traditions, later storytellers add dramatic details. Historians can't verify every element of the account, but the story reflects something remarkably consistent across Ridgeway Ghost reports. Witnesses didn't simply see something strange. They felt pursued, watched, escorted, and apparently from the John Lewis account, attacked. Whatever was haunting the road, it wasn't just appearing, it was interacting. Most hauntings become famous because witnesses describe the same figure over and over, such as a lady in white, a headless horseman, a gray man. And one of those famous tellings of the story is the disappearing woman. A woman appears walking down the center of the road. She does not respond to calls. Wagons attempt to pass her, and she blocks them. And when travelers try to go around her, she keeps pace. After several minutes or miles, she simply disappears. And this was just one of many different stories of different types of ghosts, which normally you have the same type of ghost in the area. The Ridgeway Ghost refused that pattern entirely. And as I mentioned before, sometimes it appeared as an elderly woman, as a young girl, a farmer, a priest, a rider on a horseback, a black dog, a calf, a sheep, so many different entities here. And as mentioned earlier, some witnesses claimed it became a glowing ball of light, floating just above the road. Others describe hearing footsteps without seeing anyone at all. This unusual variety has fascinated folklorists for decades. Was the ghost changing shape, or were frightened travelers interpreting ordinary sights differently? For example, a tree stump becomes a crouching figure. Fog becomes a flowing piece of cloth. Moonlight reflects from a rock. And suddenly, something becomes an apparition. And psychologists have a definition for this, which they say is the tendency for the human brain to recognize meaningful patterns in ambiguous shapes. It's why we see faces in the clouds or figures in the dark. But it doesn't fully explain why so many people reported experiences along the same stretch of road over generations. That's what keeps the legend alive. Not one story, hundreds. Each slightly different, yet somehow connected. When we return, we'll explore why sightings seem to come in waves, and how Ridgeway embraced its famous ghost, and whether this phantom belongs to history or something far stranger. Hey, Dan here. I just wanted to stop for a brief moment, give you a quick glimpse on what we have for our next Weird Wednesday. We covered Zombie Road. If you haven't heard that episode, I urge you to go back and listen to it. That is the road down around the St. Louis, Missouri area. And I thought to myself, what a perfect time to head to another haunted road. But this time we're going to go head over to the state of Nebraska. In the southeastern side of the state, just outside of Nebraska City, lies a little stretch of road that has lore tied to it for years. Officially named Road L, but better known as Seven Sisters Road. A local legend that 7 women were murdered there in the 1900s when an enraged family member from a nearby farm hung the 7 sisters on the surrounding hillside. One sister from a tree on separate hills. Today, those traveling the road have experienced the hauntings from the 7 sisters who can be heard screaming along the road. Another road, another Midwest state, another haunting. Coming at you next time right here on Midwest Shadow Files. But for now, let's get back to the story. Welcome back. So let's hear more about the hauntings going on around Military Road in southwest Wisconsin. For nearly 200 years, the Ridgeway Ghost has refused to disappear. Unlike many ghost stories that burn brightly for a generation before fading into obscurity, this one has lingered through the decades, changing with each new storyteller while somehow remaining unmistakably the same. And one of the strangest aspects of the legend is not what people claim to see, it's when they claim to see it. As the story was told and retold, researchers noticed a pattern. Reports of the Ridgeway Ghost seemed to arrive in clusters. Residents spoke of periods when almost no one mentioned the phantom, and then almost unexpectedly, sightings would begin again. One person would report seeing an unexplained light. A week later, another traveler would claim a strange figure crossed the road, and soon enough, the local newspapers were asking questions once again. Some writers even suggested that the ghost appeared every 40 years or so. There isn't enough evidence to prove such a cycle truly existed, but it is an intriguing observation. Perhaps each new generation rediscovered the old legend, repackaged it, retold it, of course with updated new variations, or perhaps people came more willing to share their experiences once someone else admitted seeing something unusual. It's a phenomenon researchers still recognize today, by the way. Stories spread, expectations grow, people begin paying closer attention, and whether those experiences are supernatural or psychological, the legend itself renews itself. Unlike some communities that try to distance themselves from haunted reputations, Ridgeway did something different. It embraced the legend. Visitors to the village today will still find references to the Ridgeway Ghost in local history. Rather than treating the story as an embarrassment, residents have preserved it as a part of the area's cultural heritage. After all, ghost stories tell us more than tales of the supernatural. They tell us what mattered to the people who came before us. As we mentioned earlier, the Ridgeway Ghost is woven into the history of Wisconsin's lead mining frontier. The uncertainty of life on the edge of settlement, and even if every reported encounter had an ordinary explanation, the legend itself is undeniably real. So could there be another explanation. What were people actually seeing? One possibility is simple: darkness. I know, it seems overly way too simple, but the military road wasn't lit. Naturally, when you think of the time period, there were no headlights, no streetlights, only lanterns and the moonlight. Mist rising from low ground can appear almost human. Tree branches swaying in the wind can resemble moving figures. You get a startled horse, and it can convince the rider that something unseen is nearby. Then, of course, you get exhaustion. Lead miners worked long hours. Stagecoach drivers often traveled well into the night. Sleep deprivation affects perception, and so does fear. Modern psychology tells us that once we expect to encounter danger, our brains become remarkably efficient at finding it. But there are still questions, right? Why did witnesses consistently describe the same stretch of road? Because this is where it occurred. Why did respectable citizens, including physicians, businessmen, longtime residents, continue reporting encounters long after practical jokes should have lost their appeal? And perhaps the most curious detail of all, why couldn't anyone agree on what they had seen? Is this simply one ghost? Why did it wear so many faces? And that's where we get into the shape-shifting theory. It seems like we are dealing with the same ghost, but one that likes to shift entirely in appearance. The Ridgeway Ghost doesn't fit comfortably into traditional ghost lore. It isn't tied to one house, one grave, one tragic death. It behaves more like a supernatural figure found in much older folklore. For example, across Europe, legends tell the spirits that appear differently to each witness. Some become animals, while others transform into travelers asking for directions. And when immigrants settled Wisconsin during the 19th century, they brought those stories with them. German folklore, Cornish mining traditions, Irish fairy tales, Scandinavian legends. Each culture carried its own understanding of unexplained encounters. So here's a possibility. Perhaps the Ridgeway Ghost became a place where all those traditions blended into something uniquely Midwestern. A ghost born not from one tragedy, but from generations of storytelling. Imagine yourself on the military road in 1855. The day's work is finished, your wagon creaks beneath you as you ride alone. The only sounds really that you really hear are the clop of your horse's hooves and the wind moving through the trees. Ahead, a lone figure stands in the road. You pull gently onto the reins. The figure doesn't move. You call out, no answer. You blink, and it's gone. You convince yourself it was only the fog, trick of the moonlight, yet your horse refuses to continue. It trembles, its ears pinned backward. You look behind you. Nothing. You urge the horse forward. Half a mile later, you glance back one final time, and for just an instant, something seems to be walking silently in the center of the road. Keeping pace, never gaining, never falling behind, you tell yourself you'll never speak of it. Tell absolutely nobody about this. But years later, when your grandchildren ask why no one traveled that road after dark, you tell them. Not because you expect them to believe you, but because you hope they'll understand. The Ridgeway Ghost has survived nearly 2 centuries because it exists at the intersection of history and mystery. There were real miners, real stagecoaches, real travelers making lonely journeys through the Wisconsin frontier, and then there were newspapers documenting strange reports, folklorists preserving local memories, communities passing stories from one generation to the next. Whether a ghost ever haunted the military road, history can't answer. But history can tell us this. Long before television, long before ghost hunting equipment, long before internet forums sharing unexplained experiences and podcasts like mine doing the same, ordinary people in southwestern Wisconsin believed something extraordinary walked beside them after sunset. Perhaps it was fear, maybe it was folklore, or maybe something none of us can fully explain. Whatever the truth, the Ridgeway Ghost remains one of America's oldest and most fascinating supernatural legends. Thank you for joining me for another journey into the forgotten corners of Midwest history. If you enjoyed this episode of Midwest Shadow Files, be sure to follow the show wherever you listen to your podcast. If you've experienced something strange or an old country road, visited a haunted location, have a family story passed down through generations that you'd like to share, I'd love to hear it. Some of the best episodes begin with the stories listeners are willing to share, and you can always reach us here at midwestshadowfiles@gmail.com, midwestshadowfiles@gmail.com. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep exploring the unknown, and if you ever find yourself driving in an old Wisconsin back road after midnight and you notice someone walking just behind you, you may want to keep driving. This episode was written, recorded, and produced by me, myself, and I. I'm Dan, your host and Midwest Shadow Files storyteller. This is Midwest Shadow Files.